Founders Forum, episode 27.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Founders Forum. We've got a good one for you today, folks. The guest is Jaffe, who has a PhD in psychology from UCLA with a specialty in behavioral neuroscience and statistics. He's also the CEO currently of IGNTD Incorporated, which is tasked with changing the way we think about and address addiction and mental health issues. So some of the backstory here is D is going to tell us a fascinating story about his unorthodox entry into the business world, into entrepreneurialism. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but trust me, you're going to want to hear his story and then how he took his checkered past and used his skills to help people. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Jaffe. Adi, welcome to the Founders Forum.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think you are a fairly unique guest compared to the ones we've had up till now, and that your background is not the normal one people would think of in terms of how you end up later advising corporate clients and such. So can you maybe tell the audience a little bit about your background that's unusual?
Yeah, you don't have a lot of guests that spent some time in jail and started their own businesses.
Well, if they have, they kept that from us.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there are probably a couple of different ways in which my past is not common. Number one, I don't come from an entrepreneurial family at all. Both of my parents had jobs. I mean, my dad was a physician, but worked in hospitals and worked in clinics. My mom worked as a human resource manager at a bank. And so the thing I was always taught was go to school, get a degree, get a job, right? And I just found later on in life that just a 9-to-5 just drove me crazy. I couldn't do it. I didn't want to work in that sort of a setting. And so that's one thing. So business, entrepreneurship, and how to think in those ways were just not ingrained in my DNA like it is for a lot of other people. But really, the second piece for me came from my own behavior, really from the age of 14 till about 26. And we moved to the States when I was 14. I'm from Israel originally. And pretty quickly after the move, I started getting in trouble. I started drinking a lot. Then I started smoking a lot of weed. By the time I got to college, I was doing both of those things daily, pretty much, and relatively heavily. And
just so I know this, like, is the kind of thing where if your parents caught you, they'd say, "What are you doing?" Or they would be scandalized?
They would be scandalized, and I definitely had to hide it. Although there's this funny story where my mom, once cleaning my room, found my bag of weed, and instead of sort of taking me to task on it, just rolled it up, hid it in the back of one of my drawers, and told me that she found it, and I better make sure my dad never finds it. So there was this element of kind of like, as long as this doesn't get too bad,
Can I
we
just
don't want
stop
to
you?
hear
What
about it.
sounded
We don't want
funny?
to know.
I thought you said she rolled it up and hid it, like took a
that's
hit.
hilarious.
Okay,
Like she took a hit. No.
Okay, yeah, that's
She put it in the back of the drawer. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Right? That would have been a very different experience. So that was kind of symptomatic in my family, like emblematic at least, I guess, of the way my family behaved, which is don't really say anything, don't really talk about anything that's wrong. You just kind of keep marching forward. And my problems kept on developing. I kept trying more and more drugs, and eventually, by the time I was now at UCLA, my family was in New York. I was at UCLA now. I found myself using meth every single day and selling drugs. And I started out selling drugs because I couldn't afford the amount of drugs, right? Drugs get expensive. And if you want to use them regularly and you don't have a high paying job when you're 20 years old and in college, I came up with the entrepreneurial idea of selling. But for me, it came out of kind of getting my own supply for free. But I will say my first entrepreneurial endeavor was actually selling, right? So I kind of got to experience, and a really funny thing for anybody listening right now who's maybe in the like the packaged goods kind of business, wholesale. Essentially the idea that you can buy a quantity, get a discount, and then sell. And so I was really just selling to my friends initially, but I kind of took on the job of collecting the money on the front end, going and finding somebody we could get it from.
Am I right, D, just to like, as an economist, we study these things, that there was a pretty huge markup in the sense that like the amount you had to pay per weight at the wholesale level, and then in terms of, could you slice it up into smaller amounts, and like that's just accounting for the huge risk that you were taking? That it was
yes,
like
so I can actually
20
speak,
transactions.
Yeah, so I can actually speak to that because I rose up through the ranks pretty gradually. And so I got to experience it in a very real way, right? Imagine sort of like literally the entrepreneur who goes to like Home Depot and buys the materials to make the stuff and then sells it, all the way to then getting to where the wood is actually getting chopped, right? The kind of following the entire supply chain. So initially, I'll talk actual quantities, right? Instead of buying one of something, I would buy like 10 or 20 of it, and you would get like a 10, 15% markdown. But yeah, by the time you get to buying 1,000 of something or 2,000 of something, right? You're getting a 80, 90% markdown. And so what happened over a period of really about 5-6 years, I went from buying for myself and my friends to buying at those, like wholesaler levels. Never got to the manufacturer, right? I never went down to Colombia to make the actual arrangement, but kind of, Mexican cartel, like those kinds of things that you really think of that you've seen in all the movies, right? Kilos of stuff and bags of drugs. And yeah, I made really, really good money by the time I was graduating college. So 21 going on 22, I was bringing in, six figures, like $150,000, $200,000 a year. And it's cash, right? It's like there's no taxes on it. You're not paying anything on it. Plus, I was getting to do whatever I wanted and party like crazy. Within 2 years of that,
Can
I'd
I
actually
ask
doubled
you,
or tripled even that income. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Let me because this stuff is fascinating to me, and you see movies or whatever. Is how so there was always the present danger of if you got arrested, that was the kind of thing, and I guess that's why those markups were there. But in terms of the people you were doing business with, was it the kind of thing that as long as you didn't fail to make a payment, you were fine? Or was it like some of them were just crazy and you just knew, stay clear of that guy?
Great question. I would say both, to be honest. So first of all, if you're making people money, the odds that they will do anything to hurt you are slim, especially interestingly, by the time you get to like the cartel level and you're dealing with cartel people, it's very clear, right? It's a money exchange. They don't even really care about what it is they're selling. They just want to get the money, and they're getting their huge markup for cornering markets. But on top of that, there was always, once I got to the level of doing, even $10,000, $20,000 cash deals, there were always weapons involved. And I have to say, I was pretty naive to that idea when I started. Like my dad was a doctor, my mom worked at a bank. Like it took me being robbed and then me being held at gunpoint while doing business to really realize the level of danger that existed the entire time. But there's an interesting story. I think stories always deliver the point far, far better. So the first time I did like a $50,000 cash deal, it had to do with a lot of ecstasy pills. And so the guys brought the pills and then we brought the cash. And because I'd never actually handed somebody 50 grand in cash, I was scared. I knew something could go wrong. Yeah. So I had a couple of guys settling for me, and I made sure they stayed in the studio. I had a recording studio. That was my front was that you always need to have some reason why people think you have money. So my front was we had a recording studio because I make music, and it was fun, right? All hours of the night. It kind of made sense. So my guys stayed, and we literally got like sticks and baseball bats, and we put them under the couches in case something went wrong. So we're sitting there. The guy sitting across from me, he came in with two of his own guys as well. So it was 3-on-3. And then we sat literally on the floor, and I gave over the bag with the money, and he gave me the drugs. And now was the job of counting to make sure that nobody shorted anybody else. So he's counting the money. I'm counting these pills, and it's literally individual pills. Like you can weigh them in 100 at a time. But these are, I think, 5,000 pills. So it takes some time to do this. Well, a pill fell, and I reached out to go grab the pill, and his guy freaked out and pulled out a gun in the middle of this thing, thinking I'm going for the money, and this is where it's all going to go down. And so all of a sudden, for the first time ever, I'm finding myself with a gun pointed at me. The joke is my guys had baseball bat. Like there was no way we were winning that fight.
Don't bring a bat to a gunfight. Yeah.
No, but we didn't know. I didn't understand. So it was after a couple of those experiences, and I'll say maybe this is the first inkling. I didn't understand it personally at the time, but I know it now. The first inkling that I'm a crazy entrepreneur was when the guns came out, I think a lot of people would go home. A lot of people would say, I'm done. This is insane, right? I got held up at gunpoint. People are robbing me. I went and got a gun. That was my way of dealing with it, right? It's like entrepreneurs,
But just to be clear, the story you just told, they didn't rob you. They just were like, hey, and then did that deal
nothing
still go
happened.
through? Okay, it was just
Exactly. Yeah.
you spooked the
Nothing
guy.
happened
Okay.
that time. It was on a different deal where somebody came in to buy drugs. And then as I was weighing out their things, it's just gun to the head and the whole hog tie, the whole thing you see in the movies over and over. But yeah, I kind of, I got to a place where I went from a completely broke college student to bringing in, $300,000 to $500,000 a year cash and being able to do anything I wanted, having 2 cars and a motorcycle, an apartment in the marina, and my recording studio. I was living large, but to cut a very, very long story that's 6 years short, I'd gotten arrested a handful of times for possession with intent to sell, serving 3 days at a time, 4 days at a time, primarily in Beverly Hills, because that was one of the areas we were selling in. So I did a pretty good job of staying out of Beverly Hills. I went through a period in my life where if I drove with you in Beverly Hills in a car, you'd be 100% certain we'd get pulled over. They knew me, they knew my face. If they saw me in Beverly Hills, they would just pull me over, knowing they're going to probably find reasonable cause. So I started circling around Beverly Hills. After my probation ended, I was on my motorcycle, actually literally in the middle of delivering. And I go through Beverly Hills because I'm not on probation anymore. I'm thinking to myself, I'm safe. That day I get in a motorcycle accident. I break my leg on the motorcycle. I'm laying on the ground. And I'm pretty sure they were already following me because the first 2 cops that showed up on the scene were undercover cops. They weren't in a marked vehicle. They found the drugs in my jacket. They take me away for a week now. A couple of months later, they raid my apartment. They find even more drugs. And now I'm facing 13 to 15 years in prison, $1 million bail. The big stuff hit finally. And
can I ask you a question at this point?
Moments for me. Yeah, of course.
Is it possible you subconsciously made yourself get in an accident to stop all this?
It's funny because back then, it's amazing what perspective gives you, right? I wouldn't have considered myself high, but I was never sober for those entire 7 years. I was always on something. So I was on drugs while riding my motorcycle. And honestly, I think my attention span and my ability to kind of maneuver quickly were just not sharp enough. It was a quick little accident. If I walked you through the story, I did everything I could to avoid actually being arrested. But to your point, that experience was probably the only experience I could imagine that would have actually gotten me out of dealing. Because not only was I facing decades in prison now, my leg was broken. I couldn't really work because nobody wants to come to your house to buy drugs from you when the cops just arrested you, right? And then the SWAT team comes. So it got so bad that I either was going to have to go all in on this criminal life and just have nothing in my future at all. And I knew what that looked like. I'd known other guys who'd served 7 years, 10 years, got back out, were out for a year and a half, 2 years and got back in. So I knew I needed to do something else. But I'll be honest, and this is, I think, where this is important for this specific show. I had no idea what else to do, right? I'd barely graduated college and I'd been a drug dealer for 7 years. That's all I knew how to do. I didn't really understand a concept that I now understand so much better, like this concept of transferable skills. And what do you know how to do? What do you not know how to do? How do you leverage that to have a career? So I went to jail. I ended up serving a year after all the court stuff was done. But in that process, I got sober. I ended up being sober for a total of 3 years. But I got sober both in terms of chemicals and then in my mind, just having to ask the real question with my parents and say, what's next? I'm 26 years old. Other than this drug dealing career, I have nothing. I got evicted from my apartment. My cars got taken away. I've got nothing in the world. What's next? And, I mentioned before, both my parents came from careers where they got jobs, right? That's what they did. I tried for 9 months to get a job after jail and I just couldn't get hired, right? You have that little box. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? And I'll tell you, once you check that box, nobody calls you back. So for 9 months, I tried to get a job and I couldn't. And then my parents and I had a really heady conversation and we made the decision, I've got to go back to school. It's the only way I can get out of this mess. And so serendipitously, that was my route. I ended up going back to school. I got my master's and then my PhD in psychology over the next 4 or 5 years.
And there's no barriers like that to going back to school, or do the schools, like, is it possible a certain program wouldn't accept you, even
100%.
whether they
Yeah.
officially told you that or not? But you don't think so?
No, I think there's 100% certainty that there will be programs that won't take you. I'm pretty sure there
Oh,
are
okay,
programs.
okay,
I'm pretty sure there are programs that directly ask that same question. This program at
okay.
Cal State Long Beach didn't. And even though this is not entrepreneurship, I wasn't founding a company yet. I think there's an important story here, and it's sometimes the route you have to take to where you're going is circuitous, right? It's not a direct route.
Right.
And you wish you could take the direct route, but it's just not available to you. I didn't know what to do next. School was the one that made sense. And I had a lot to overcome. And there may be other people listening right now who have a lot to overcome before getting to the next phase. I had 2 years in my master's program and then 5 years in my PhD program. So 7 years during which I worked as a teaching assistant and then a research assistant, and eventually was able to actually teach when I was close to getting my PhD. And so the jobs I held during that entire 7 years were only within academia. So, when you're going to school at UCLA, you can get a research assistant job, but I couldn't go out and get a job. And there are still, by the way, to this day, I got arrested in 2001. So 22 years later, I still get reminders on a regular basis. Like, I was going for an SBA loan a couple of years ago, and they turned me down because of my criminal history 20 years ago. So there are always reasons for me to remember where I'm coming from. It just makes me work harder at this point. But once I finished school and I had this PhD, I really had to start thinking, okay, what do I want to do with this thing? And it was really at that point that I started having more kind of, I'll say, normal jobs, right? You show up to an office at 9 a.m., do your day, and then go home. And I just realized pretty quickly that was not going to be satisfying to me. And so for somebody like myself, I'm going to say there weren't a ton of other options other than starting my own thing because of my history, right? Getting other people to trust you, getting other people to jump in with you on something, let alone hire you for some high-end position somewhere, is pretty difficult when you have that kind of history.
So how did you actually do it then?
So I found another psychologist, and we ended up opening a treatment center. So the first path I went into was directly into addiction treatment. Two things. First of all, in that space, a lot of people have a drug history, so nobody really holds it against you. And that was a really positive thing. And the second piece was we kind of identified a niche that wasn't being served. We thought we could do a good job of it. I knew nothing about running a business. So it was just the two of us. We sat down, we made some initial plans, literally rented a small office in Beverly Hills, opened it up, started business. And man, I think I could have done much, much better in that business now with 8, 9, 10 years of experience. We grew pretty quickly. We were a small team, grew pretty quickly, expanded too fast. So we took that business. I had a co-founder with me, and together we took that business from zero to about $600,000 in revenue in year one, took it to about $1.3 million in year two. And as year one was ending and we were seeing the ramp up, we had these big dreams. And then the big dreams, we got a massive office, right? Like a 5,000 square foot office with a build out with a 5-year commitment.
Right.
And ended up kind of overstaffing, getting a little too complex, too big for our britches, if you will.
And the revenue was just individuals, or like it was government?
Nope, just treatment clients.
Like okay.
Yeah. No,
who were just paying
clients.
Out of pocket, or does insurance cover that?
Mostly out of pocket. Towards the end, we started taking insurance. But this is something I struggle with to this day, to be perfectly honest, but I'm getting better at it. I like going fast. I don't like growing slowly. And when I saw that happen, I really, in my head, imagined us going to 5 million, year 3 or year 4, and try to grow to scale that. But my skills in terms of actually being a business owner were nascent. I was a baby. So when all of a sudden I had a team of 20, 25 people, I didn't know how to manage. So
well, that's what I was going to ask you, because when you were throwing out those revenue numbers, that wasn't just you and your partner just seeing clients 10 hours a day, right? Or you took on staff?
No, great question. Yeah, we created right off the get-go, pretty much, we created a program. So I don't know if anybody knows anything about mental health treatment, but essentially it was an outpatient treatment program. So people would buy packages, and some of the packages were incredibly high-end, like $10,000 for a week. Others were a little bit more mid-market, like $3,500 a month, things of that nature. But because we identified a pretty solid niche, especially back then, right? This is 2010, 2012. The niche we were serving was almost unheard of in this country. Still, in a brick and mortar, it's not that well served. And so people flocked, right? Even with relatively low marketing efforts. We would get
Sorry,
on
I missed that.
podcasts.
What is your niche that was unheard of?
We do non-abstinence. Still to this day, I do non-abstinence addiction treatment. So most treatment centers in the country will not accept you if you are not planning to completely quit everything.
Okay.
And we said, if you want to reduce your drinking, you want to smoke less weed, if you're not looking to completely quit, we'll hold your hand, we'll take you through it. And that's a very particular niche in my space.
Because for most people, they think, oh no, it's going to be too easy. If you're still doing it once a week, you're just going to ramp it up. It's better you got to go cold turkey. Is what they're thinking?
Yep. I mean, in the industry, the idea in general is quitting is actually the only path. That's the only way you can really fix addiction. And I'm speaking, by the way, from personal experience, right? I was addicted to meth for 7 years and I'm now a social drinker and I'm fine. And we're talking 16 years later. So yeah, so it was fun. It was really, really fun to build that business. I also learned a lot of things about ownership stakes and partners. And I mean, that business blew up, unfortunately. It didn't end comfortably. A lot of infighting, a lot of things that I would have changed about how that business ran. But I learned how to even think and project and understand how to run a business. And so that business ran for about 5 years. We had to close the doors after that. I ended up with some debt afterwards. And for the first time after jail and after school and everything, right? It had been 7 years of school, 5 years of this business, so 12 years since I'd gotten arrested and got my stuff together. It was summer. I was teaching at UCLA at the time, but it was summer, so I had no classes. Maybe I had one class, but I think I had no classes. And I just closed the business. And I had about 4 or 5 months to sit and think about what I wanted to do. And this was in 2016, 2017. And I realized that the future of addiction treatment is going to come through technology. One way or another, it's going to come through technology. So I decided to use that platform and start creating virtual help options for people. And again, we're now talking 7 years into that experiment. So always learning on my feet. But nobody knew what Zoom was. Nobody understood video conferencing, right? It felt like the Jetsons. Everybody thought I was insane for thinking you could even offer help for people online. And I started doing this, really, a laptop recording videos.
Because the idea was like, oh, you need to have the face-to-face personal connection. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Like that was their thinking.
Yeah. And I think, again, I know this by now. Well, no, I think I knew this small little fact even back then. Really successful businesses break the mold, right? That's essentially what they do, is they shift the way people think about things, right? Think PayPal and money, or eBay and buying things online, Amazon bookstore, right? The idea is they completely rejigger the way you think about certain things. And that's what we were trying to do with this online care, right? The idea is, and for anybody who's either in that space, most people have been affected by addiction at some point in your life, by either you personally or somebody you know. And so one of the biggest problems is not only is this stuff expensive, but you have to go somewhere for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or you have to dedicate all this time. Most people don't have that time. And I was thinking to myself, we've got these phones. I can talk to people on their phones. They can do it from their lunch at work. It just seemed to make sense to me. And I was looking to impact hundreds of thousands or millions of lives, not 50 to 100 people a year like we were in the treatment center.
Well, and do the two go hand in hand, if I'm following? Because I think isn't part of the reason for those really, for people who don't know at home, like some of those 12-step, like going away and staying like rehab, the people go away for 2 months or something. Like it's ludicrous how much the price tag is on some of those things. It can
be upwards of $100,000 a month.
Yeah. And is part of it though, because they're saying, oh, well, we got to completely get you away from your friends. And because if it's abstinence, whereas with yours, you don't need to like pluck them out of their friend group and take them away and put them in, witness protection program. Because you're teaching them the skills.
I would say even so, a couple of numbers for everybody, right? Identifying a market, right? 90% of people who have addiction issues never go into one of those kinds of professional treatment centers. Why? It's incredibly expensive. The logistics are a nightmare to figure out. And they make you quit. And most people who rely, let's say, just on alcohol to get through their day, the idea of never drinking again is a huge hurdle. You have to get really, really bad to get there. my idea was, let's make the solution easier and simpler for people who are just thinking about, hey, I'm drinking too much. I need to stop drinking or slow down my drinking. But the other piece is brick and mortar facilities are actually much more expensive to operate. You have to have all your staff show up every day to the same session. Some of these places, they try to be on the cliffside in Malibu, which means the house is like a $10 million home just to attract people. And so there are all these logistical components to it. But what I found is the opportunity that I think is the most meaningful one is you want to give people help the moment they're ready to get help. Even if somebody has the money, it can often take a week or 2 weeks from the moment they have that first phone call to the moment they walk into that treatment center. A lot can happen in a week. You can sign up with my program today and start in 3 hours, right? Like there are some of the barriers that exist. But we're talking now post-COVID. In 2017, people thought I was absolutely insane. Nobody believed that it could happen. But it was me, a laptop, and a microphone. So I didn't have a lot to lose. It was a pretty bootstrap business. It's always been a pretty bootstrap business. And I could start small. I also had a lot, I don't know if anybody relates to this, but if you've ever started a business with partners and it blew up, I had a lot of fear about bringing on other people. I had such a bad taste in my mouth about having to run things through other people and the infighting that can happen. So in late 2017, early 2018, I started what is Ignited, which is a company I still run to this day. And what has happened over the last 6 or 7 years, we sort of expanded beyond just thinking of ourselves as an addiction platform to kind of like a self-help coaching. A lot of people come to us struggle with relationship issues, or let's say porn addiction, which a lot of people wouldn't put in the same category as kind of like drugs and alcohol, but things that are really interfering with their daily functioning in much less kind of extreme ways than what you think to yourself about people who would go to rehab.
That actually raises an interesting question. I've heard the theory, I'm wondering what you think, that it's, just to boil it down, that, somebody who is diagnosed as an alcoholic, so yeah, they quit drinking, but then they just start overeating. Like, in other words, it's more of a personality thing. It's not so much, I'm addicted to alcohol.
Yeah, so 2 different concepts there, and I want to just touch on them separately. So that's called like an addiction transfer, right? Is you have one addiction, if you can stop it, you go to another addiction. I think that speaks to the problem with primary treatment. Primary treatment just tries to get you to stop doing the thing you're doing. But, and this, everybody will understand is if they've ever seen anybody who struggles. Somebody who struggles with drinking, let's say like a 12-pack a day or a fifth of vodka or like 2 bottles of wine, their real struggles are not with alcohol. Their real struggles are with life, right? They have a hard time living. And you can make it a personality thing. It could be a biology thing, right? Genetics. It could be an environmental influence. They grew up with a lot of trauma. They grew up with a lot of other people drinking. They don't know how to cope. It could be a spiritual thing, right? Like they have no purpose. They feel lost. They feel bored, disconnected. So Ignited, which is the name of my company, the reason it's called Ignited is the idea is we have to ignite. We have to spark something in this person to literally shift the way they think. And I have this saying I say to all of our clients, anybody can beat their addiction to anything. You just have to become somebody who's not addicted. And what I mean by that is it does often take a wholesale change in your life. It could be the people you're with. It could be where you live. It could be the job you have, the relationship you're in, how you wake up in the morning, what you eat, what you drink. Like, we have to look at everything, because the reason you're showing up the way you're showing up is not actually because the alcohol or the drugs. The alcohol, the drugs are the medicines that make it tolerable for you to survive in this world. We have to shift the experience you have in the world.
For you to beat your own addiction, was there, like, are you using whatever you personally, in other words, are you teaching what you learned, or did the 2 not go hand in hand?
Not only do I teach what I learn, I lead some of the groups and I do a lot of the work in our platform because I still need it. I don't know how you feel about this, but we're talking about entrepreneurship and being founders. I don't think there's ever been a founder who's been successful. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You've talked to many, many more than I have, who did it completely by themselves without gathering information and learning from other people and maybe even getting support and help from others, right? You need to learn. You need to learn about money, or you need to learn about how to deliver product. You may need to learn about supply chain logistics. You may need to learn about management. You may need to learn about leadership, right? There are all these things that make a founder successful versus unsuccessful. And I used to think, and this is literally a last 4 or 5 year revelation for me. I used to think that the idea was I had to learn how to do everything. And now I realize that is dumb. I don't have to learn how to do everything. I have to get the people together who know how to do everything and then together we will produce what is there. And so I think it's the same thing around self-development and creating the life you want. Some people try to just muscle their way through life and just deal with what comes and deal with it primarily inside. I think to really get where you want to get in life, for all of us, whether you ever struggle with addiction or severe mental health issues, it requires community, it requires ongoing learning, it requires being open-minded and being willing to shift and change the way you do things. As in business, it's the market changes, but in your life, as the environment changes, as circumstances change, right? What worked when you were 19 years old and well-functioning doesn't work when you've got a 7-year-old child and a wife. It doesn't work when the market takes a hit and all your investments go down in value. So like all these things are elements of life that, at least my conceptualization of what I teach to my clients, is you always have to be thinking with a beginner's mind. How can I get better? What can I still learn?
Do you, out of curiosity, incorporate, is there a spiritual component to what you do, or you just base it off of what the client wants, how they want to handle that?
Yeah, so spiritual, not religious. To this day, my spiritual connection to what I do is actually around purpose. So because the work we do impacts thousands of people, I think at Ignited, we've got, about 20, 30,000 lives we've touched over the last 7 years. I look at that as my purpose, my spiritual connection. We definitely do have many, many clients who are religious also, but we have a lot of clients who are completely either agnostic or don't believe in anything. So atheists. And so to me, spirit just means like almost like your soul, your spirit, right? Like what is it? What drives you? What gets you going? I think what I do know, or what I believe anyway, right? Things can always change. I believe that if you don't feel like you have a purpose, I believe that if you wake up in the morning and you feel like what you do doesn't matter and it doesn't have a bigger context that it's involved in, you don't believe in things bigger than yourself in some way, then it really takes the flavor and the color out of life. And then you can have all this stuff. You can have the cars, you can have the jets, you can have the women, you can have the money, and it just feels pointless, right? Because it doesn't feel like it matters.
Now, is it worth, I'm asking this because I think probably some listeners are wondering like how your approach compares or differs from like the standard 12-step. Because that's one of those, the 12 steps, right, is like acknowledge that there's a higher power or something like that.
Yeah.
I believe.
It's not just even acknowledge. The difference between what we do in 12-step. In 12-step is you have to admit that you're powerless and give your power over to a higher power. I think that's a pretty, that's a big step away from recognizing that there is something bigger than you. Like, I'll tell you here, again, I think stories are a big deal. So we were living in, I'll call it the slums of Beverly Hills. If anybody knows Beverly Hills in real life, you'll understand what I mean. But it's like, there's the Beverly Hills you see in the movies, and then there's like the apartment complexes that are on the outskirts of Beverly Hills, and they still have that dingy kind of alleyway in the back where all the trash stuff is. It's not very fancy, but it's in Beverly Hills per se. So we were living over there, and I was going on a jog in the morning, and I was running past a school. I want to say it's their junior high, and either the junior high or one of the elementary schools. There were like 2 elementary schools there. So I was running, and there were all these kids playing in the yard. And it hit me like a lightning bolt in a split second. I was like, you know what? It's not hard for me to believe that there's something bigger than me. The combined life potential of the kids in that schoolyard is bigger than me. I'm one person. I don't think I want to delude myself to imagining how much I really matter in the universe anyway. But whatever I matter, 150 kids running around during their recess, their collective lives bigger than mine. And so that perception alone just made it really become tangible for me. I mean, look at the world. All we have to do is look around at the world that we live in. It's obvious there are things, even just the rest of humanity is a bigger force than I am, right? Let alone the universe and the forces of physics that keep us all hurtling through this universe, etc. Everything is bigger than I am. You can call it the universe, you can call it God, you can call it spirit, you can call it math and the laws of nature. You can call it whatever you want. But all of that collectively far bigger than I am. But I don't need to give control over to it. I need to recognize that I'm part of it. That's at least my version of it.
Okay, yeah. Also, too, it's not just that there were 150 of the kid, but to me at least, like if I'm playing with my kids or something, like they have so much more potential.
That's what I'm saying.
Because they're still like, it's just their brains are more plastic and they can easily pick up another language, that kind of stuff.
Like future families, the future impact on the universe, right? Like those 150 kids, their current families, their future families, and everything they do in the world is nearly endless in terms of what I can conceptualize. And that's what I mean. So for me, spirituality is a much more tangible thing than religion. I grew up in Israel. I'm not very religious. I don't really believe in organized religion all that much. And that's just my take. One of the things I pride myself on in my work is I don't need anybody else's take to be mine. I want to support everybody in developing what works for them, because if they find what works for them, then this goes back to the addiction piece. They just don't have to run as much. And if they don't have to run as much, they don't need to use as much.
So I'm curious, did you, I'm trying to think of the way to phrase this. Did your experience as being like a pretty high level drug dealer where, serious money flows and seeing some violence, did that influence, and then you were also now in a different, in a more corporate sort of mainstream, officially legal white sector activities. Do you have any things, like for example, in The Godfather 3, Michael Corleone, he's dealing with the Vatican and, I forget the line, but like the higher up I get, the more crooked it gets. There's that kind of cliche.
Yeah.
Or on the other hand, I'm guessing like if your partners are worried about, wow, these creditors are really breathing down our neck, and you're like, yeah, well, they're not going to stick a gun in our face. So, Anyway, any observations like that?
I have that going on with the SBA right now, right? I got an EIDL loan and we're paying it back, and I was behind on some payments. I was like, look, I get an email, right? And a letter. Yeah. It's okay. Like, I'll figure out how to make the next payment. It's all good. That's number one. Number two, when you've lived in that space, the idea of having uncomfortable conversations with employees is not that big a deal. I mean, I literally, just to give you an example, one of my quote unquote employees, the guys who used to run drugs for me, decided he didn't want to work for me anymore and he left. Well, he also ended up leaving with $25,000 worth of drugs that he never brought back to me. So I went to his house, gun in hand. He opened the door and I just literally did that thing that you've seen in the movies, God knows how many times. I just put the gun to my belly, like just make sure that he understands it's there. I'm not pulling it out. I'm not like doing anything with it. But I said, do you have the stuff? Went into his living room, got me the stuff, handed it back, closed the door. Like, having uncomfortable conversations right now with my employees is easy, right? And I
now
think
it's
as a
more
leader,
like leave your security badge when you walk out, please. Yeah,
leave your security badge, or hey, what do you think in doing things this way? Like, what made that seem like it made sense?
Yeah. Do you need Cobra? Yeah,
I know, right? Well, and now because I advise and coach a lot of really, really successful entrepreneurs, like people who've done exits and then turn around and realize their marriage is in shambles. Or people who are CEOs or founders of now companies that are doing, 10, 20, $50 million a year in revenue. Sometimes those are their struggles. As the team doubles in size, how do you still keep your culture and your vision moving forward when you don't know 80% of the people who work for you anymore, right? Some of that stuff is a problem with, we've all heard this phrase, right? What got you here isn't going to get you to the next level. Growth mentality is something that many of us feel stuck with at some point. At some point you hit a wall and you feel like, man, can I really make that next leap? And I think what I learned through all my addiction work, because I've worked with musicians, I've gone on the road with DJs and bands, I've worked with NFL coaches and athletes. I mean, I've worked with people who are really, really, really successful, but they get stuck. Not always around addiction. They just get stuck and they have habits that are keeping them back. And so I've really moved back from thinking about addiction as its own separate problem. It's it's a habit that you picked up that served you really, really well at some point, right? Maybe drinking made you be able, like it did for me, come out of your shell when you were 17 years old and you were really shy in high school. When you drank, you could talk to girls and you weren't super embarrassed. Or maybe when you were studying, also like for me, in college and somebody gave you some Adderall pills or some other uppers to study, you started doing that. And next thing you know, you're doing it every day. Right? Sometimes or maybe you were a housewife. This happens to me all the time. A housewife, really unhappy in your marriage, but you have nothing else to do. You start going to lunches where you start drinking wine at noon. Next thing you know, you're driving your kids drunk at 3 p.m. picking them up from school because you've been drinking since noon, right? People look at that, each one of those audiences that I just described and think, oh, they have a drinking problem. They have a drug problem. They don't have a drinking problem, a drug problem. They have a life problem. And so for me, it doesn't matter if you picked up alcohol or, and this might be really familiar to some founders, a work addiction, where anytime something goes wrong in your relationship, anytime your kids act out, the first thing you run to is work. You go, know what? I'm going to go back to the office and do 5 more hours of work, showing up at home at 1 o'clock, barely sleeping, bleary-eyed the next day. And your wife is like, where'd you go last night? So I deal with those clients now as well. And to me, the rationale underlying it is always the same. And that is, when you're not comfortable showing up to your life, having the difficult conversations or the great conversations, showing up into the rooms that you need to show up in, you will find ways to hide. And those ways may work right now. But normally, if you continue that path for 5, 10, 15 years, at some point, they'll become dysfunctional. And I normally get involved when they got dysfunctional.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Is your, I don't know if coaching or therapy is the right word, or maybe but is it the same pattern and you just tailor it to the specific person, or for each of those hypothetical people you just listed, would what you tell them be radically different?
I'll say the overall structure, like the framework, is similar. There are different tools I use with different people. I'll say it over here again. Here's one thing I learned in drug dealing. As long as you don't get too big, you're not going to make enough noise and nobody's really going to care. It's once you get big enough that people pay attention, right? Like you can kind of, and I'm not suggesting or telling anybody to break laws, but like if you break the law in your business and you make like $150,000 a year in a small town in the middle of nowhere, probably nobody's ever going to pay attention. Take that business to 15 million, 50 million, and do it across different states. And next thing you know, it becomes a huge problem, right? And so I now do work. I've not been trained in this, et cetera, but I've now incorporated some psychedelic medicine into some of my work, which is a little more out there, not a little more, a lot more out there for a lot of people. But a lot of my clients deal with resistant depression. So there's things like ketamine and other medicines that are really, really useful for those, a lot of trauma and things of that nature. So I'll say it like this. Think of me as like a carpenter, right? Like a carpenter shows up with maybe like a toolkit that has 70 tools. The tools are the same when I go to every job. What tools end up being useful for a specific client may be different.
It's interesting that you raised there. Can you speak a little bit in case the listeners, because I've known that for a couple of years now, at least, that psychedelics are becoming more
huge
accepted. There's published peer-reviewed literature on, especially treating depression, things like that.
20 years of research. It's not even new research, right? It's like a long library of research. Psilocybin. Look, I mean, Rick Perry is pushing psilocybin to get legal, right? It's crossed the aisle and it's understood. People with severe trauma, people with severe depression, people who are debilitated by their mental health or addictions benefit greatly from these things. Not to tout this specific statistic too much, but my wife and I also do a lot of relationship work, either for entrepreneurs or people who just, again, for whatever reason, found themselves on the brink of divorce and it seems like there's no way out. We've worked with a few dozen couples and we're still batting 1,000. And for some of those clients, MDMA therapy in particular has been incredibly powerful in overcoming relationship trauma. A lot of people, I think especially people like us, like entrepreneurs, we get so focused on KPIs and outcomes and results, we forget to actually be present in the moment and feel what's happening and be connected to the world around us. And I know, at least for my partner and from a lot of other partners of guys I've worked with, that can wreak havoc on your relationship. And so those are not the only therapeutics, but the three main ones that I work with are ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA. And each one of those has decades of research behind it. The question is not whether they work. It's, are they going to become legal to use therapeutically in the next 2 years or 10 years? That's not clear yet.
Right. And I think ketamine too is also like for severe pain treatment. I know ketamine, that.
Ketamine, first of all, ketamine is legal. Secondly, it's used for anesthesia, both animals and children, widely, and it started to become used more often even in EMT work because it has this interesting quality where it's almost impossible to overdose on it. Whereas like an opiate painkiller, you can overdose and die from. And so they'll use ketamine in emergency situations, but they don't have time to assess a person for dosing and all that kind of stuff. You give them a ketamine shot, it's a dissociative anesthetic. So it separates them from their body and they just can't feel the pain.
Yeah. I mean, the remaining time we have here, Adi, can you maybe speak, because a lot of what you're saying was resonating with me. And I think being able to quote work from home cuts both ways. Because on the one hand, it's like, oh yeah, you can go on vacation, but then on the other hand, it means you're never not at work. Like even if you're sitting there playing with your kid, technically I'm thinking like, oh yeah, in a minute I should go write an email to that guy. And it's like, so you're kind of always splintered.
Yeah. I mean, I'll talk about it from both sides of my business. For my contractors and the people that work for me, it provides a massive level of flexibility. But with flexibility comes the need for boundaries. And I think that's true in life anyway, right? And so think of the fact that like airplanes have Wi-Fi now, right? We used to be able to go on a plane and just tell somebody, I'm on a plane for 5 hours. You can't get a hold of me.
Right.
That excuse doesn't fly anymore. Your car, even if it doesn't have Wi-Fi in it, has a hotspot from your freaking phone. Like you're technically supposed to be able to connect at any time. Well, here's the good news about it for anybody listening right now. That's called boundaries. And you need to figure out what those are for yourself. They're not the same for all of us, but you need to figure out what they are for yourself. If you have a partner or a family, you need to figure out what those are for those people. That's one piece. The second piece has to do with how do you show up to work? So for instance, like my office is literally downstairs. I'm sitting below my kitchen, right? So it's great. My commute used to be an hour and a half, and now my commute is about 1.5 minutes if I walk slowly. That's great, but I do have to bucket times. Otherwise, I end up finding myself here at 11 p.m. doing the work. So what I really try to do, and right now I'm not doing a great job of it because we were gone for vacation, so my office was used as storage, is to really pretend like this is my office. So it's where I do my work. I'm not going to go sit in the dining room table. Why? Because then I am in the middle of my regular family life and it interferes with everything. And so that's one really, really big piece that I had to learn when I moved to working from home. It was a huge shift. It probably took me a few years to integrate. And again, all this was before COVID, so nobody was doing it. So I had to kind of develop my own set of rules.
Great stuff. I think we need to wrap it up there. Adi, can you tell people if they want to learn more about what you do, or maybe even consider trying to bring you on as a consultant or a coach, where they can go?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to find me is just adjaffe.com, a website I started literally for this question. I never really had a personal website because it always felt, I don't know, it always felt egocentric somehow. But because I got this question all over different podcasts, there's a website now at djaffe.com. It'll tell you both about the work I do around addiction and our platform. So it has a link to that, but it also has a link to my coaching and speaking and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, you know, that work I've been doing for the last decade, and it's really getting in with organizations is really, really fun, because what you normally find is each one of the people within the organization is having a similar set of problems. And if you can help it solve it for the whole organization, everything runs more smoothly.
Well, great. Let me spell it. So it's adijaffe.com is where you want to go, folks. Our guest has been Adi Jaffe, and very glad to speak with you, Adi, and keep doing what you're doing. It sounds like you're really making a lot of difference in a lot of people's lives.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks so much for having me on.
And thank you, folks, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.